Hello, everyone. So today I'm going to talk to you about how storytelling is reshaping the memory of the 1947 partition. So let me start by my personal story. When I was growing up, I spent all my summers in a tiny little town in North India called Faridkot. We were so close to the border between India and Pakistan that I grew up watching 2 state-controlled television channels, while most in India and Pakistan in the 1980s only had 1. So we watched Indira Gandhi and Benazir Bhutto. In those days, outside our homes, there was a civil conflict that was also waging on. Curfews were becoming the norm, and suspicion and uncertainty were in the air as government forces were seeking the Sikh separatists amongst us. This is in Punjab. Meanwhile, in the comfort of our home, we mostly did not notice a lot of the communal tensions that were going on outside. Life continued on as usual. Mass blackouts in those days were normal in the small towns, as summer nights were mostly devoid of electricity, so we spent them outside under billions of stars on our rooftop, watching tiny little satellites as they crept across the sky. We dozed off to our grandparents telling us stories about ancient kings and queens that used to rule that part of the world, and about lions, and about snakes, and about fascinating visitors from other places that used to visit, bring their goods, and so on. Every now and then, reality would creep in, and we would hear stories about the disappearances of so-called terrorists that were living amongst us. Stories from those days sometimes stick out to me more than the lessons from my textbooks in school in the years that followed. And in fact, some of those stories inspired my love for nature so much so that I got a PhD in physics. Some of those stories also sparked my interest in human conflict since I was surrounded by it as a kid, so much so that it led to the work that I'm doing today that I'm going to talk to you about. So storytelling, as it turns out, there's a reason that it's so powerful. So I'm a scientist, and neuroscience tells us that our brains are actually wired to learn from storytelling. In fact, one-on-one storytelling between 2 people creates a bond that is so vital for our minds that we crave it once we've experienced it once for the first time. So it was in this manner that I first learned about the story of partition, about my own family's personal connection to partition. So my paternal grandmother sat me down. I was living in the US at this point, so it was a few years later. She sat me down, she told me the story of how she took her 3 little children across the border, how she fled the violence. There were times where their Jeep had to run over dead bodies. When I heard this story, it sounded really surreal to me. It sounded almost unreal. It was hard to believe. I wanted to learn more, so I began to dig deeper. But as I dug more, I learned that the narratives of partition was mostly about politicians and political motivations and so on. And I learned about very big numbers with lots of zeros. So 10 million, perhaps 15 million people migrated at the time of partition. And that number goes up to about 20 million if you look into the 1950s, because the displacements continued on. These are very big numbers. And in terms of the number of women that were abducted, it seems like the number could be as high as 100,000. In terms of the number of children that disappeared, we don't even know because nobody kept count, and the number of children that were orphaned. In terms of the number of people who died during the violence, that number is also contested today, so we don't have an exact number for that everybody agrees upon. So that was the public memory of partition. It was a story of ice-cold numbers and contested accounts by political leaders. Those numbers did not account for the human toll, and they did not capture hearts. Yet, we were so wed to those narratives that they had led to a lot of cross-border tensions. I wanted to know more. I wanted to know who those people were that my grandmother's Jeep may have ran over. Who were the people that helped her survive? Who were those other 10 to 14 to 15 million people? I felt that the story of partition was actually a tapestry that combined stories of the millions of people who had actually experienced and witnessed it, yet the stories were largely unknown. And I wanted to do something about that. There was a fear that if we did not record our history, we would build our future on a faulty and less understood history and a faulty sense of identity. And so I wanted to do something about it. I just didn't know what. These are just some images from the time of partition that show you some of these 10 to 15 million people that were migrating. So the aha moment for me came in 2008 when I was doing a part of my PhD in Japan. I took a trip down to Hiroshima. And before I went to Hiroshima, I had read books about the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and how that affected the people there. I had watched movies on the subject, but nothing hit me quite like the testimonies of survivors that I saw at the memorial. Those stories were incredibly powerful and they hit me to the core. One of the things that I learned was that those who survived, those who managed to survive the atomic bomb, they struggled for the rest of their life. They had trouble finding marriage partners, they had trouble finding jobs because people thought that they were contaminated. So nobody would hire them and nobody would marry them. When I was watching those stories, I noticed that it was a combination of their body language, their facial expressions, and their words that made their stories very real for me, and I could relate to them. Suddenly, the events of Hiroshima and Nagasaki became very real, and I could relate to them as a human. And I realized that those stories of the witnesses gave those events legitimacy. They gave them importance. They inspired research. They inspired people to dig deeper. And in that moment, I realized that that's what was missing for partition. It was a disappearing history, despite the fact that it affected us so tremendously. It was such a massive 20th century event, not just for South Asia, but the whole world. But it was a disappearing history. And one of the biggest reasons, in my opinion, was that we did not have the witness voices. And so that realization led to sort of a mad rush to collect oral histories of partition witnesses. So in those early days, we realized that one or two or a few of us could not do this work. There were simply far too many people and they were spread out across the world, and we wanted to record all their stories. And so what we did is we devised a workshop together with experts from UC Berkeley, which is where I was at the time, and Stanford University, and we devised an oral history workshop so we could rally people from around the world in joining us to record these stories. And it worked. So more and more people started watching these workshops from around the world, and they began recording stories in their communities. The idea was that anyone, anywhere, could log in, learn to watch the workshop, use a camera or their smartphone, go out in their community, record these stories, upload them to the archive, and then the stories get shared on social media. And that inspires even more people to come forward with their stories, but it also inspires reflection on partition at a grassroots level. And so in that way, we began our work. And over time, hundreds of citizen historians from diverse backgrounds all over the world and all sorts of communities came together and started uploading stories from communities that we were just completely unaware of being affected by partition. So let me just go through quickly and show you some of these stories. So here's a story that came in from Geneva camp in Dhaka in Bangladesh. And that's a camp that's been around since 1947. So there are a number of people there who are considered Biharis who are still there. And this story came in back in 2011. This is Farhana Afroz, a citizen historian who's recording Muhammad Hanif. As another example, here's Gayatri Chakraborty. Her story came in from 24 Parnagas in Bengal. She migrated from a village in what's now Bangladesh over to Bengal in India. And here's a fascinating story. This story has come in from what was formerly known as the Northwest Frontier Province in Pakistan. This is from Swat district. And it's in a language that's disappearing. So in effect, in addition to preserving history, the archive is also preserving languages as a side effect. So the language is called Torwali, and the gentleman, Abdul Mateen, is sharing his story in Torwali, and I think there's less than 3,000 people now who speak that language. Here's a story that's come in from Jammu and Kashmir, and what's fascinating here is that this story is from a district called Mirpur, and we hear stories from that district all over the world from survivors, yet there are no physical documents documenting the violence that happened there. Once again, demonstrating the importance of recording the people's memory, because you get information from people that may not have made its way into documents. And how do you check the validity of it? You simply cross-check by looking at different people's stories who may not know each other. Here's a story of a man named Jeffrey Langlands, who was a school teacher in Islamabad and stayed behind at the time of partition. He's over 100 years old today. Here's a fascinating story of Daniel Golan, which was recorded in Israel. And he came from a Jewish family that migrated from Karachi to Pune and then eventually Bombay. And then in 1948, he was recruited to help build Israel. So he went and moved into a kibbutz as a 14-year-old boy and lived in Israel. Here's a story from right here in Delhi, from Old Delhi. This is Mr. Mirza Changezi being recorded by Ritika Popli. So Mirza Changezi is 104 years old today, and he was one of the few people who did not migrate over to Pakistan in 1947 from Old Delhi. Here's a story of a man, Muhammad Yusuf, who migrated from East Punjab to West Punjab, and it's submitted by Taha Shaheen, who now lives in Karachi. So this is just to give you a glimpse. We have over 4,300 stories in the archive, 4,500 rather. This is just to give you a glimpse of the diversity of stories coming from unique places that we didn't think were affected by partition. How many people thought that there were partition witnesses living in Israel today, or the Northwest Frontier Province in Pakistan? So in this way, hundreds and hundreds of people came together over the years and have submitted more than 4,500 oral histories. That's over 8,000 hours of video footage. And the stories come from 350 cities around the world in 12 countries and are told in 22 languages. The stories are followed by over 750,000 people on social media and shared over 10 million times just this year alone. So you can see the shift in public perception. Our goal is to record 10,000 stories through the end of next year. So let me give you an example of what's happening with so many people recording and sharing stories. There's a sort of critical mass that's starting to build up. So when we first started this work in 2010, there was a lot of fear and uncertainty. Sometimes people would talk to us several times before they would agree to share their story. They wanted to know, are you from the government? Why do you want this story? Why does anybody care? But there's been a huge shift. After so many people have shared their stories and they've gone viral on social media over the last 7 or 8 years since we began this work, today, in fact, there are entire neighborhoods, as some of our story collectors in West Bengal will complain, where everybody has shared their story with the archive and there are no more stories left to record. So the stories also challenge some of our most closely held beliefs. And these include beliefs about identity, about culture, about our apparent enemies, and about our past. So one of the interesting things that comes about in the stories is when you record stories from what were former kingdoms, and there were over 500 of them in South Asia prior to 1947, you see that people's identities were tied with their kingdoms. They had not heard of India or Pakistan until 1947. Same with many of the villages. We've recorded many people who were from villages in Bengal and Punjab, and they think of themselves as Bengali or Punjabi, and they had never heard of India or Pakistan until 1947. So that becomes really fascinating, especially when you consider our modern, very deep ties to those identities. Also, another fascinating thing that we find from the stories, I mean, there's a lot of fascinating things, but I'm just giving you a few examples, is how economics changed across the countryside in South Asia. You used to have villages before that were completely closed economic units. So clothing, oil, food, everything, almost everything that they needed was produced right there in the village. But what happened during partition is because caste and religion and profession in some villages was so closely tied that you had entire professions disappear from villages. You had villages where all the farmers left, or you had villages where all the artisans left. And suddenly, there was a need for goods that were no longer being produced locally, and all of these villages were thrust into the global economy. So massive economic shifts happened during partition that aren't really understood to this day. Also, there was a great loss of knowledge that we have not quite acknowledged. We hear of stories over and over again where huge libraries full of one-of-a-kind books went up in flames and were burnt down. Another thing that comes out from the stories that you don't find in documents is the origin of the violence. This is a big question for everyone. Why did neighbors start killing neighbors? Well, one of the things that we find from stories is that, it doesn't make sense. Why would neighbors kill neighbors? And the stories tell us that neighbors, in fact, didn't really kill neighbors. In fact, most of the times, neighbors protected neighbors. We find, both from interviewing people who contributed to the violence and who were victims, that people did not attack people that they knew. So victims often did not recognize their attackers, and attackers would attack in places where they did not know anybody. And the motivation, quite often, for the violence was loot. And so it turns out that the violence seems to be mostly economically driven, and religion was an excuse. So that's just something that oral histories help us dig deeper into, but obviously it needs a lot more research. So I hope I've given you plenty of examples of how oral histories complement documents and the information that we find in government archives and libraries. Another curious little fact that I'll mention before the end of my talk is something that I encountered when I personally was recording stories in the Punjabi countryside. I would go from one village to the next, and the first thing I would get asked is, what village are your grandparents from? And what's your last name, and so on. When I would give them this information, a lot of times people would go back 200, 300 years and connect how my ancestors somehow knew their ancestors. And so it was okay. I was okay, and I was allowed to go into their village and record their stories. And from this process, I discovered that up until about 1 or 2 generations ago, a lot of elders, a lot of people were memorizing the last 30, 40, 50 generations of their ancestors, a practice which has pretty much disappeared. I don't know too many people my age who know even more than their last 2 or 3 generations of ancestors. So those are some fascinating examples of knowledge that's disappearing. So I'm going to quickly play a segment of a video for you from an interview before I end this talk.
Then, when I was 12-year-old, then my life changed. I met my friend. With him, I found that I belonged to somebody. And I was not alone anymore. What my friend taught me, I forgave to even people who killed my family. My own way of thinking is that just love everyone, hate no one. That's where I look at it.
So I just wanted to leave off on that note, especially the way he ended his story. It's about forgiveness, and it's about empathy across the borders. And I think that's another important thing that the stories can help us do. They can help us see the other as just as human as ourselves. Thank you.